Nick Reiner is convincing the public he shouldn't even face a trial, but behind that calm, confused act is something far more dangerous. And if this story ends the way the system thinks it will, someone else is going to die. The most dangerous part of this story isn't the crime itself. It's what's happening after. In the days following the arrest of Nick Reiner, something strange began unfolding in real time. Public sympathy started growing. Headlines softened. Commentators began floating a narrative that felt off. The idea being pushed was simple but powerful. Nick Reiner isn't fully aware of what's happening. He's confused, childlike, medicated, too fragile to even stand trial. And that framing matters because when enough people believe it, accountability quietly slips out the back door. Within hours of the charges becoming public, clips started circulating. Not of the crime scene, not of evidence, but of Nick's demeanor, his posture, his silence, his blank stare. These weren't random leaks, they were carefully selected moments designed to tell a story without saying it out loud. A story where the accused slowly becomes the victim. And that shift happened faster than most people realized. Hey race, why this matters right now. The justice system doesn't just respond to facts, it responds to pressure. Public perception shapes legal strategies, jury pools, even charging decisions. When a narrative takes hold early, it hardens. And in this case, the narrative forming around Nick Reiner is dangerously incomplete. Because while the public is being told to look at who he appears to be now, almost no one is asking who he was right before everything collapsed. That's where the timeline becomes critical. Surveillance footage shows Nick Reiner moving through a convenience store just hours after his parents, Michelle and Rob Reiner, were found dead in their home. The video isn't dramatic at first glance, no running, no panic, no visible blood. That's exactly why it's unsettling. His movements are controlled, purposeful. He isn't disoriented. He isn't confused. He's navigating space, making choices, aware of his surroundings. And when police finally close in, his reaction is instant. Hands up, compliance, recognition. He knows exactly what's happening. This is the first crack in the he doesn't understand reality storyline. But instead of focusing on that contradiction, attention shifted elsewhere, toward mental health, toward medication changes, toward claims that Nick understands what happened but can't grasp why he's there. That distinction sounds clinical, but it's legally explosive. Because if accepted, it opens the door to arguments about competency, diminished responsibility, even removal from trial entirely. And this is where Hollywood enters the picture. Through documentaries, talk show segments, and carefully worded commentary, the framing becomes almost cinematic. A tragic son, a broken mind, a system too harsh for someone so fragile. Fox Nation specials. TMZ investigates. Familiar faces explaining, softly, that Nick Reiner's brain can't process consequences. That he knows his parents are dead, but not that he's in jail because of it. A paradox that, on its face, doesn't quite make sense, yet it's being repeated often enough to feel true. But repetition doesn't equal reality. People who have spent time inside the system recognize this pattern immediately. The vacant stare, the delayed responses, the I don't know what's going on posture. It's not new, it's not rare, and it's not accidental. It's an act that works because most people have never seen it up close. They don't know how often it's used, or how effective it can be when the audience wants to believe it. And hey, raise the question no one seems willing to ask, yet if Nick Reiner truly doesn't understand where he is or why he's there, how did he manage to survive on the outside for years, navigate social spaces, attend elite gatherings, and function well enough to avoid intervention until now? That contradiction sits at the center of this case. Because if the confusion is real, it didn't start in jail. And if it started in jail, then it didn't cause what happened inside that house. Which means something else did. And that's the part of the story we haven't been told yet. In the next section, we're going to rewind not to the arrest, not to the headlines, but to the environment Nick Reiner was living in before everything broke. The substances, the paranoia, the warning signs people ignored, and the moment when perception finally snapped away from reality. Because what happened didn't come out of nowhere. To understand what actually happened, you have to step away from the courtroom narrative and rewind further than the arrest footage. Long before police lights lit up that sidewalk, long before the convenience store video started looping on the news, Nick Reiner was already unraveling, just not in a way that fit the version now being sold to the public. The first thing that gets quietly left out is consistency. Mental collapse doesn't usually arrive on schedule. It leaks. It leaves residue. People notice patterns before they notice emergencies. And in Nick's case, those patterns were there, scattered across months of behavior that didn't quite add up. Erratic moods, sudden intensity, long stretches without sleep, moments where conversations drifted into paranoia and then snapped back like nothing happened. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough that, in hindsight, they read like warnings. This is where the drug narrative enters the conversation, and it's being used very carefully. The suggestion isn't just that substances were present, it's that they were responsible. That Nick didn't choose violence, the chemicals did. It's a clean explanation. Comforting, even. Because if drugs are the villain, then Nick becomes collateral damage. A cautionary tale, not an accountable actor. But that explanation falls apart the moment you look at how substance-induced psychosis actually behaves over time. People who use heavily don't flip a switch overnight. The paranoia builds in layers. At first, it's subtle and edge to conversations, a sense that people are watching. Then it escalates into misreading tone, intent, even facial expressions. A harmless comment starts to feel loaded. A glance becomes a threat. The brain begins connecting dots that aren't there, constructing a narrative where danger feels imminent even when it isn't. And crucially, that paranoia doesn't make someone helpless. It often does the opposite. It sharpens focus, narrows attention, creates a distorted sense of urgency where actions feel justified, even necessary. In those moments, the person isn't confused about what they're doing. They're convinced they have to do it. That distinction matters, because it completely contradicts the idea that Nick Reiner was wandering through reality without comprehension. There are reports of Nick attending high-profile social gatherings in the period leading up to the killings. Rooms filled with industry figures, loud music, bright lights, alcohol, substances circulating quietly in corners. Environments that amplify paranoia when sleep deprivation and stimulant use are already in play. People noticed he was jumpy, defensive, reading into conversations that weren't about him, laughing 1 minute, withdrawn the next. Again, not enough for intervention, but enough to suggest something was spiraling. Erase the detail that almost no one is focusing on. Paranoia doesn't disappear when the party ends. It follows you home. And once that mindset is locked in, familiarity can become the most dangerous trigger of all. Because the people closest to you are the ones you believe know the most. They become part of the imagined threat. Words spoken with concern get reinterpreted as judgment. Silence feels like plotting. Even love starts to feel conditional. That's the psychological terrain Nick Reiner was likely moving through in the final hours before his parents were killed. This is where the "he didn't know what he was doing" argument collapses under its own weight. Because violence driven by paranoia isn't random. It's targeted. It involves perceived threats. It involves timing. And in this case, it involved a weapon that requires proximity, intent, and sustained force. Those aren't the actions of someone detached from reality. They're the actions of someone trapped inside a false version of it, one where fear feels logical and harm feels justified. And then, just as abruptly as it escalated, it stopped. Nick didn't flee the state. He didn't barricade himself. He didn't spiral publicly. He moved through the world quietly until police intercepted him, which raises an uncomfortable question. If he was truly incapable of understanding consequences, why did his behavior suddenly stabilize after the act itself? That shift suggests something else entirely. In the next section, we're going to look at what happens when forced sobriety enters the picture and why the version of Nick Reiner the public is seeing now may not be confusion at all, but something far more calculated. Because withdrawal can look a lot like innocence if you don't know what you're seeing.
The last part you just said is important because it's like you do have to realize that there are some good things from your life and whether or not you want to include them.
What the public is seeing now, the quiet demeanor, the vacant expression, the almost childlike stillness, is being framed as evidence of mental collapse. But there's another explanation, one that rarely makes headlines because it's uncomfortable and harder to sell. Forced sobriety changes everything, and not in the way most people think. When someone has lived for years inside, chemical stimulation, especially stimulants, the absence of those substances doesn't bring clarity right away. It brings a crash. The body slows. The mind dulls. Emotions flatten out. Speech becomes delayed. Energy disappears. To an outside observer, it can look like confusion or even cognitive impairment. But internally, something very different is happening. The noise is finally gone. County jail accelerates this process. There's no access to the usual escapes. No late nights. No substances to regulate mood or suppress anxiety. Sleep comes, whether you want it or not. And with that sleep comes memory, reflection, awareness. This is the phase where reality starts leaking back in slowly, painfully, and without mercy. That's why the he doesn't know where he is narrative doesn't line up with the environment he's in. Because if Nick Reiner were genuinely disoriented, jail would make that worse, not better. Instead, what we're seeing is stabilization, a flattening, a withdrawal state that mimics fragility. And it's during this window that performance becomes possible because the system is actively looking for it. People who have spent time inside recognize the pattern immediately. The slow responses, the soft voice, the distant gaze. It's not new. It's a survival strategy, especially for someone facing charges this serious. Present yourself as non-threatening, as incapable, as lost. Let the narrative do the work for you. And the timing couldn't be more convenient. Because just as Nick's public image shifts toward vulnerability, key conversations start happening behind closed doors. Competency evaluations, medication reviews, psychological assessments, each one shaped, in part, by the behavior he presents. Every pause, every confused answer, every moment of silence becomes data. And when the expectation is confusion, confusion is what gets recorded. But erase the contradiction no one has addressed yet. Withdrawal doesn't erase understanding. It heightens it. When the artificial confidence and paranoia burn off, what's left is raw awareness. And awareness brings guilt. Guilt brings shame. Shame brings collapse. That internal crash looks quiet on the outside, but it's anything but empty. It's a person replaying events on a loop with no chemical buffer to interrupt it. That's why the idea that Nick can't process consequences doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Consequences are all there is in a cell. No distractions. No escape. Just time. And time has a way of cutting through denial faster than any interrogation ever could. There's another factor here that's being ignored: experience. People who truly don't understand where they are don't adapt. They don't follow routines. They don't respond appropriately to authority. Yet everything we know suggests Nick has been compliant, oriented, capable of following instructions, capable of managing himself in custody. Those aren't signs of cognitive collapse. They're signs of control, which raises a darker possibility. What if the calm is intentional? Not in the sense of manipulation alone, but self-preservation. Because Nick knows something the public doesn't. County jail is not the end of this road. It's the waiting room. And what comes next is infinitely more dangerous. Prison is a different ecosystem entirely. Different rules, different incentives. And for someone with Nick's history, substance dependence, paranoia, and proven capacity for intimate violence, the stakes change overnight. In that environment, weakness isn't protection. It's currency. And appearing fragile now may serve a purpose later. This is where the story takes a turn that few are willing to confront. Because the question isn't whether Nick Reiner understands what he did. The question is what happens when he's placed in a system where the very conditions that fueled his worst behavior, access, pressure, and proximity, are built into daily life. And in the next section, we're going to look at why some people believe this case doesn't end with a verdict and why the most dangerous chapter may still be ahead. Because what Nick did once, the system may unintentionally give him the tools to do again.
The whole process for me, I can just speak for myself, it did make me understand him a lot more, and I think it made me a better father. Hopefully it did.
The mistake people make is assuming that prison neutralizes danger. It doesn't. It rearranges it. And in cases like Nick Reiner's, it can actually sharpen it. Everything about the environment he's heading toward mirrors the conditions that already pushed him past the point of no return: pressure, paranoia, and access. Inside prison, drugs don't disappear. They change form. They move underground, traded through favors, debts, and desperation. Stimulants circulate quietly, passed hand to hand, often paid for not with money, but with risk. Holding something for someone else, running a message, taking a fall during a search. For someone already prone to compulsive behavior, the gravitational pull back into that cycle is almost inevitable. And then there are the weapons. Handmade blades appear constantly, crafted from everyday materials. Possession is routine. Violence is currency. In a shared cell, sleep becomes vulnerability. Privacy vanishes. Tension never fully drops. This matters because Nick Reiner has already demonstrated something crucial. His violence isn't impulsive chaos. It's targeted, intimate, and deliberate. He didn't lash out in public. He struck where people were defenseless. That pattern doesn't vanish behind bars. What makes this even more unstable is the collapse of external support. Reports indicate his legal representation has stepped away. Family backing has thinned. Financial lifelines are drying up. That isolation changes incentives. Without protection, without resources, survival becomes transactional. And transactional environments reward people willing to cross lines. The most unsettling part is this. Nick won't need to seek out danger. It will find him. Cellmates change. Power dynamics shift. Debts form quickly. And once substances re-enter the picture, even briefly, the switch that was flipped before can flip again. Paranoia doesn't need much fuel. Just enough. The system will watch his behavior, monitor his stability, file reports. But systems respond to incidents, not probabilities. And by the time warning signs become visible, damage is already done. This is why some cases don't feel closed, even before trial. Because the real risk isn't whether Nick Reiner is punished. It's whether the conditions around him are quietly assembling the same ingredients that led to the first tragedy, only this time, inside walls designed to contain it.
I should probably shut up and listen to him because he knows a lot more about this. He knows I don't know anything, so I'll learn whatever he has to teach me.
The most uncomfortable truth in this case isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about pattern recognition. Nick Reiner isn't an unknowable mystery or a tragic exception. He's a case study in what happens when dangerous behavior gets reframed as fragility and warning signs get softened into sympathy. What the public sees now, the silence, the stillness, the confusion, feels easier to process than the alternative. That this was never about losing touch with reality, but about living inside a distorted version of it for so long that violence started to feel justified. That the drugs didn't invent something new, they just removed the restraints on something already there. And the unanswered question still hangs in the air. If the system couldn't stop this once, what makes us so certain it will next time? Justice isn't just about verdicts. It's about foresight, about recognizing when accountability matters not only for punishment, but for prevention. This story isn't over, and the silence surrounding what comes next may be the loudest warning of all. If you want to keep following stories where perception and reality collide, make sure you're subscribed.